I feel like Stretch has this way of expanding beyond what is considered a traditional classroom, a composition classroom. And so the students have more of an opportunity to sort of engage in different kinds of writing instead of just getting to, let's say, an essay.
We talk a lot in the beginning about kind of the culture shock of coming from high school into the university. And actually, the Stretch program itself has helped a lot with that because students are coming in with a little more confidence because they know they're getting credit for both semesters in their courses. And I feel like we've gotten kind of rid of that negative connotation of remediation because these students are in their composition course. It's just section A and then section B. So that helps too, explaining them why the course is set up in the way it is, telling them that we're all going to be together the whole entire year, I think really helped them kind of take more risks than they normally would have in the courses before.
The most important aspect of freshman Stretch is the cohort 2-semester structure of it, in that teachers, supplemental instructors, and students get to stay together for about 35 weeks instead of 15.
Knowing that I and my students had an entire year to get it right, I noticed with my students even that their anxiety level dropped immediately within the first week because they didn't feel like, oh my God, I must be a perfect writer in the end of one semester, knowing that we were going to set a foundation in the first semester and then expand on that in the second semester, just really created a nice tone for the classroom.
Actually, my students are already saying, am I going to have you next semester, right? Because they feel, and it's not just me, it's the SI leaders, it's the other students, and this cohorting creates this environment of being comfortable because writing is personal, right? And so you need to be feeling comfortable in the environment that you're in to continue. And so I think this cohorting is a great idea.
How I handle 1.1 is, that's the first exercise of the class. So I give them a really tough reading, something difficult to read, something that will drive them crazy. And then I ask them to summarize it. We then bring those summaries to class and we have a discussion, and it's really interesting to see how, though the summaries are basically the same, students get different things out of those readings that we assign. They focus on different items in the assignment, and that's where we get our first lesson. We don't all read and see the same things, even though we're reading the same text. And then we can begin that discussion on rhetoric.
The notion of summary is one of the important parts about critical reading. If they understand it, then they can summarize it, right? So I use the summary as a critical reading exercise. We sort of identify like the main arguments, what are the main points of a topic, and then be able to sort of teach my students how to just not identify these things, but at the same time put it in their own words. If they can put it in their own words, then we have some critical reading happening.
I actually moved the summary to the last exercise to prepare them for their essay so that they would have to think about, okay, when I set up my introduction and my essay, how much summary do I need to give my reader to understand what I'm responding to?
What's really great about the letter to a friend and letter to a family member is it's really teaching the notion of audience. I introduce my students to rhetoric that way. I use an exercise from John Bean's rhetorical reading and just to introduce the notion of exercise and how you adjust yourself as you write depending on your audience, so that when they go into the letter writing, letter to a friend or family, letter to the author, they themselves understand the moves that they're making, the changes, the adjustments they're making in terms of the letters because of who their audience is.
That's the first question they ask is, I've never written a letter to an author. What do I do? And I tell them, pretend you're writing a letter to a celebrity after you just watched a movie that they made. What would you say to them? Would you be a fanatical fan who seems, sort of stalkerish, or are you going to be complimentary and, be very admiring of them? What does it feel like to write to someone a letter, someone you don't know? And I said, if you had to text someone that you didn't know, how would your language be different than if you were texting your friend?
I think the best way we kind of were able to get our students to understand genre and be able to kind of identify what they were in fact doing in those pieces were when we were having them write, let's say, a letter to the author.
Yeah.
They knew who their audience was, and they absolutely knew what they should say in order to get a response from that author, and maybe, you know, what they should not say to that particular audience.
I do a response paper. This is actually where I introduce the idea that response is not just yes or no, right? This is where they need to attempt to try to really convince their audience to say maybe, to sort of gain an understanding, a nuanced understanding of the world, and definitely that they're basing it on a response to an essay or to an article that they've picked. I think reiterates that idea that it's an ongoing conversation. They're entering a conversation. It's nothing new, but rather they're adding on something new to something that's already ongoing.
So I focus on introduction and concrete thesis statements, clear thesis statements. I focus on organizing the essay and structure. So I start there with a very nuts and bolts approach, and then later in the second and third progressions, then we can start expanding and playing with language a little more.
So far, I've been able to take the progression exercises and use them quite effectively to scaffold my essay assignments. And as I continue teaching in the Stretch program, I expect that those connections will be made stronger. I'm always learning things from my own methods, from the responses I get back from the students, and looking for ways that I can make those assignments more effective. So far, I'm exceptionally pleased with the results.
So again, like progression 1 is more about summary and critical reading, which of course they can use in any class. And I always take it out and do what I call the outside conversation, the bigger picture. What are we learning here that applies to other classes and the world in general? And then second progression, visual literacy. Okay, now we've got textual literacy, let's take it out to visual literacy. Now let's start really arguing about it. Let's start having really hardline positions and see if we can defend them.
So what I do is I take a PowerPoint and I shoot up a picture of Norman Rockwell's classic painting, Thanksgiving, where you've got Grandma and Grandma and the big turkey. And I ask them, what does this say about life in America, you know, in the 1935, 1940, right after the Depression? And they go, oh, you know, life is good, everyone is fed, everyone is happy, there's no worries. And then I hop to another image of Norman Rockwell's painting, Ruby Bridges, where you see the very young African-American girl being escorted to school by federal marshals. They're throwing tomatoes at her. And I go, this is from the same artist, one that just celebrated the greatness and the richness and the wealth of America, who 20 years later has suddenly changed his opinion about what America is. And we see how he uses visual and text. What does Norman Rockwell now believe about America, you know, 20 years later?
Well, with progression 2, I think this was the point in the semester where I sort of made it a little bit more fun for the students. I gave them some topics, but they got to choose their image. And what we did in class was the students would write a description, a brief description, and they could get creative about the picture without revealing what the actual picture is. The group would present their description, and the rest of the class had to guess what their picture was. After that, we revealed the picture, and then we're able to compare. So which one was more powerful? Was the words more powerful, or was the image? And in some cases, it really differed on how the description was written. So I think that sort of iterated the whole notion of rhetoric does exist in both visual and textual, but it all depends on how you're treating the audience.
From the word picture, they go to the scene, and they're creating a scene around this image that they had done. And then from there, they're going to the ethnography. So everything is related.
So this semester, we had them go to gyms, since the new SRC Student Recreation Center opened up, so they get to go there for free. And they're there to exercise, but also to watch what happens in gyms. The action of people at the SRC becomes their text.
you know, getting the students outside of the classroom was the main point, because yes, they can read, and often they have very, you know, theoretically based ideas or ideal ideas in their head because it's from readings. But when they go outside, the observation sort of really opens up their understanding of whatever their topic is, and at the same time they're able to see how other people react to a certain thing as well. So I think that, you know, the ethnography is an important component in terms of visual rhetoric.
And in creating the word picture and the scene and isolating those two aspects, I think it really helped to give them more of an understanding about description. And they'll be able to take that then into the next progression where I talk about argument and understand that when you're looking at problems, you need to describe problems. And they'll be able to take that understanding of objective and subjective and then look at what they're reading and think about what they're creating.
And in fact, just today, which was the last day of class, we kind of did a little just review of the class. And I asked them, what were your favorite readings? What were your favorite assignments? In A, they really liked visual literacy. They said it was difficult because it was a brand new concept to them, but they said, I wish I had been taught this when I was growing up because it gave me a new perspective on the world. And they said, I can see how it made my writing deeper because I was thinking about writing from a different perspective.
One of my favorite progressions in the A section is arguing through texts. It's the third progression. And actually the second exercise that we do for that progression is a dialogue. We ask the students to write a dialogue based on some of the readings that they've been doing. And what was great is their essay was about Facebook and how it affects identity. So I had given them some readings from either psychology journals or from the news about that topic. And then they were able to do a discussion between themselves and two of the authors from one of those readings. And it was great. The students got so creative about it. They were hosting talk shows or doing it through a radio lens or having everybody meet in a coffee shop. So they set up the setting and then did the dialogue. But I think the best part of that was then I actually saw them address a counter argument within their essays. And this was the first semester where in their second draft, every single one of my students actually attempted at getting to a counter argument. And I really attribute that to the dialogue exercise that they had to do.
This semester we're coming to that right now, and it's based off of sort of a Socratic dialogue, and where you're engaging in discussion, and they can choose. They can choose whether they want two of these authors to be in a discussion, or they can choose imagine a person that is arguing or just engaging in conversation with one of these authors on the topic.
I do not permit figures from popular culture, but I have my students look at the essays that I have provided basically for Progression 3. They're working with literacy narratives, and they'll be writing their own literacy narrative. So from the selection of literacy narratives that I provide, I have them picture these writers together in a discussion on Facebook, and what they might be writing on each other's walls, what they would disagree about. So we're using new media, but not figures from pop culture.
There's what are you going to be arguing? What are the kinds of methods that you'll be using? I actually use this for the 115 in the project as well. They write a proposal for the project and they write a proposal for the third progression, because it's a different genre of writing, and they might have to do proposals in their different disciplines that they go to after this class. So it is an argumentative proposal that they're stating their point, that they're making an argument as a whole about their topic, but it might change, which is fine, which happens in a proposal.
I find this reflective essay to be very significant, especially as the students are moving from semester A to semester B, because this is a process-driven curriculum, and this gives the students an opportunity to reflect on their own writing process, what they've learned, and essentially they can work towards transferring what they've learned to the next semester.
As they write their reflective essay and they look back at their portfolio, it helps them write a stronger reflective essay.
And they also get the idea of audience. You know, I tell them it's not just me, I'm not your audience. And then they get a realistic sense of audience too. And they say, oh, other professors are reading my essays? Like, yes, you know, I'm just a representative of this audience that you are writing to. You are also in this academic community as students, right? So then it becomes sort of a community learning experience.
Of course, it's for instructors too, so that we can see what they're learning in the classroom. But most importantly, it's a really ego-boosting moment for them when they realize, when I came in here 16 weeks ago, I was terrified of this class, and now that we've done these exercises together, I have learned X, Y, and Z. And I tell them when they write this letter, you know, don't tell me if you had fun or, you know, if you thought supplemental instruction was cool, but really, what did you learn? Articulate 3 or 4 things that you didn't know before you came into this class, and it makes them proud of themselves.
I do formal lessons on library research. I touch on web research. We use a lot of the databases that our university provides, but I do limit them to a number of sources. So I do the bulk of the research, and then I give them choices.
The OVIAT library has a program there, and I send my students, we make an appointment, and we send them to the library, and the librarians there, the teaching librarians, are excellent. It takes a load off of teachers, and there they are told how to do online research and how to do hands-on books research in the library. I recommend it to all of the instructors. It's a resource for us. Use it.
I do ask my students to work with MLA format throughout the whole semester, but I do not grade their ability to use MLA format. Basically, I have them focus on their ideas and communicating to an audience using a rhetorical approach.
I do use MLA, but I have in the past introduced both MLA and APA because when I looked at my roster, none of my students were anywhere close to the humanities. So I gave them a choice whether if they wanted to use APA, and I went over both in class. If they wanted to use APA, they could use APA.
Grading is always an issue for instructors. It's a lot of grading to do. I find that allowing students, since we're forming a community anyway, to not grade each other's work but provide feedback. I'm pretty lenient. I'm like, if you do the work, you'll get credit for it. I'm grading only the final draft of your essays. If you do progression 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, you get full credit for that. I'm not going to go A, B, C, D. I tell them to hand it off to a peer, have them read it, and give you feedback. And they don't mind providing that feedback for each other.
And that's especially what I noticed in B that works really well, because in A, they're still nervous, they're still not sure what's expected of them with academic writing. By the end of that semester, they feel like, okay, I'm an academic writer. Now in B, they can really start to fly with it and really start to dig deeper into critical thinking and critical reading and take some risks in their writing, which some of them did. They wrote about some pretty controversial topics, or they chose a hard concept to argue with.
Yeah, definitely. I love Project Web. And in Project Web, it's asking us the students to make a blog. So what I did is I molded a problem solution paper into becoming an advocacy blog for that problem. And the students loved this. It's a medium they know and that they like. And I remember in one of his reflections, one of my students talked about how they not only got to write a paper, but then they got to share it with the world.
I do not require or assign them to read anything about this. They were born into this, what we call new media. It's been here since the day they were born. We talk about the abuses of media and how media can be used to distort the truth and reality. And they're very aware of that because of Facebook. No one's telling the truth. And so we do have that discussion about sort of the ethics of using media.
In my class, we read about we just currently read The Importance of Being Literate, which is an article I found in a student journal online. I also had them read the article, Is Google Making Us Stupid? By Nicholas Carr. The idea is we started talking about media literacy in our class, and why is it important? Why is the notion of literacy changing in this world, and why is technology sort of changing the way we think as a society.
I had them reading a little bit about, and we do this in the first semester as well, about visual rhetoric. So they're using a lot of what they learned about visual rhetoric to play with ethos, pathos, and logos visually in their blogs. And I think advocacy blogs really work towards that, because I hear the students say, oh, we really need a picture of a really sad puppy for our, animal abuse advocacy blog, or whatever it was that they were looking at.
What I found to be the most productive was actually switching over to strictly blogs and having students actually comment on the essay or the piece of writing immediately. So there was this sense of immediacy, and so you could go back and, even as an instructor, take a look and see what the other students were thinking, as opposed to having them simply fill out a sheet that you would eventually get back. So everything was happening in real time, as opposed to this kind of stagnated workflow that I think, doesn't necessarily need to be there any longer. I think that we can get to the point of letting students know exactly what's going on, and even as instructors ourselves, go in and give them immediate feedback. So they themselves are going, all right, this is what I'm doing right, this is what I'm doing wrong. And there isn't this waiting any longer. There's this just sense of, all right, let's do this, because that's the world they live in.
For my students, what they did was they did field work, right? And a lot of them did a lot of creative things. I had one group sort of compare Forever 21 and the Black Market White House, which is a women's store. And they didn't just compare the clothing, but they started comparing the ideology behind these two stores, in terms of societal expectations. Why do women of a specific age have to dress in a specific way? Why is it priced a certain way? They started thinking about the socioeconomics of the space itself.
Because they had already been taught some ways of looking at things, using certain visual principles. Then with Project Space, they had to look at not just a picture, but a space using logos, ethos, pathos. How does this space create a rhetorical triangle, and how does it affect you as an occupant of this space?
But I used Convergences. It's a Bedford St. Martin's book. It has a chapter in there on space, so that helped me a lot.
They do whatever it is that they choose to do. For example, this semester I had a student redesign a movie theater. He hated movie theater spaces, and so he actually created a model of a theater space. Another student was upset that in Washington, D.C. they decided that homeless people couldn't go to the library, so she went to the library, observed homeless people in the library, and wrote a letter to the president about how we should handle this new law that sort of says if you're homeless you can't use a public library.
For my B section this year, I knew that my students weren't quite ready to open up space to a bigger interpretation. So what I did, I chose a graphic novel for that project. So we were actually looking at the space of the page and why the graphic novel is set up the way it is.
By the second semester, they're already taking classes. Obviously, they're taking 4 classes, and so they're taking political science, they're taking sociology, and I tell them, take some of the themes that you're learning in your other classes and bring them here and integrate them into your projects.
I would say my favorite would be Project Space. I felt that I went really deep into analyzing Facebook and how advertisers and how Mark Zuckerberg uses all this information, and how he personalizes our online experience.
For Project Space, that's sort of where I wanted to push them was, think of this as not just a writing class, but think of it as you're doing an anthropological study, you're studying some sort of culture out there, and you have to pretend that you're a scientist out there doing a study, and I thought that was fun.
biggest comment I got at the end of this year was that they loved being with the same students and the same teacher throughout the whole entire year. One, because it meant that we got to start right away in B. We were just up and running after our break. And two, because since we do so much peer review and revision and they're learning that writing is a recursive process, it's good for them to be comfortable with their classmates and who they're working with in something that is a little scary. It's hard showing someone else your work, but since they've been working with the same students all year, they know each other's strengths and weaknesses. They can say, oh, I'm having trouble with my thesis, but I know Adrian's really good with thesis statements, so I'm gonna go talk to him. And a lot of that was happening outside of class.
I assign a lot of novels for them to read, and they get mad, why are you reading so many novels? And then we get to project text, and I go, now this is why you read all those novels. So this semester, they're going to be analyzing 3 novels from 3 different writers from 3 different historical and racial backgrounds, and I ask them, find the commonality in these 3 writers. Then they start having fun. Oh, that's the purpose. Even novels link to each other. Even poems link to each other.
For project text, they had a choice of 3 different texts. We did Persepolis, which is a graphic novel. We did Watchmen as a graphic novel, and then they could also read The Hunger Games, the first book. And I let them choose from about 5 or 6 texts that I brought in. And what they did was, as a class, I put them into reading groups according to the text they were reading, and they had to find for themselves what were the themes and what were the common patterns.
Students are already telling me, oh, I had this essay in my history class, and I remembered the progression 1 from last semester, and that's how I drafted out my paper. They're transferring what they're learning a lot better than before when you only had them for 1 semester.
We studied Water for Elephants by Sarah Gruen, and I really like this novel because we got to talk about the circus, the carnival space, and I introduced them to Mikhail Bakhtin and stuff like that. So I introduced some theory, but what was even more interesting was I divided the students into groups, and each group was assigned 5 chapters. They had to present on the chapters. They had to do a character analysis, a plot summary, a textual analysis, and they also had to present for the class different themes that might be within those chapters, and they had to present outside sources.
Project text is traditional if an instructor decides that they want a literary analysis essay at the end. It's non-traditional if you allow them to use other ways to do their work. For example, a student is writing a play, because we're doing project text right now, writing a play where the writers of these 3 different novels are having a conversation with each other. So it can be non-traditional too.
As soon as we start reading those progressions in that language, we start interpreting it. And then whatever we interpret that into our assignments, our students are going to have another level of interpretation. And I always look at it as I recognize limitation of my perspectives. You know, they always have some unique angle to take, and I know that, so I invite that. So I feel like we wrote Stretch together, that they really helped give me a sense of what was possible